During the discussions of removed abilities in WoW, it's often the case that an archetype of a class was gutted for being too unbalanced, unfun, or just doesn't fit a class anymore. In this video, we're going to go over some Druid abilities that have been removed, rating them on a scale of how fun they used to be, their usefulness, and why they were removed in the first place. And at number 10, we have Natural Insight. This ability would be added in the Mists of Pandaria expansion and eventually removed in the Legion expansion, only lasting for about 2 expansions in total. It actually was just a passive ability granted to Balance and Restoration Druids at level 10, making it as a pretty simple entry in our list. All it did was increase the mana pool of your Druid by 400% of its current total. And that was it. This was especially important going into Mists of Pandaria because at this time, many of the classes had heavy overhauls to their specializations because of the removal of talent trees. At this point, talent trees were far too inflated, and adding more to the bottom of a tree every expansion made classes too difficult to balance. So Blizzard instead opted to create a new system. Every class would get very special rehauls of their costs in the talent trees, now being a selection node with 3 abilities pertaining to the class as a whole, rather than their specialization. Because of this, balanced druids became much less reliant on their mana management, and thus could jump DPS at will on bosses and dungeons alike. Also, giving Restoration Druids 400% more of their mana allowed for just better healing throughput, of course. A lot less worry had to go into how to recover their mana, and they could spend their healing spells with a lot less punishment, something modern druids actually struggle with in a raid environment. It wasn't until Legion, when this passive was removed, that balanced druids shifted to their now well-known Astral Power resource. This resource now generates power through multiple filler spells to then unleash more devastating attacks in its Boomkin's kit. So eventually, mana management was removed completely for a balanced druid. Although Restoration Druids still struggle with mana compared to other healers as it currently stands, so this ability would be a welcomed reintroduction if Blizzard were ever to consider the future. But probably not, as even another 100% of their mana pool would be way too much. And at number 9, we have Faerie Fire. Added in vanilla with WoW's release, this ability stood the test of time for Druid players. Originally, what it used to do was simply decrease a target's armor by a certain amount for 40 seconds. Additionally, the target struck will then not be able to enter stealth or even vanish so long as the ability is applied to them. This ability was often used by Feral Druid tanks in Classic WoW, even up to Mists of Pandaria. Now, normally if you wanted to reduce a boss's armor to make sure you could deal more physical damage to it, you would use a Warrior's Sunder Armor ability. But you don't always have a warrior in a dungeon group, so that's where this comes in, and if you find yourself in a situation where a rogue is trying to escape you, Faerie Fire might make sure they cannot leave your sight. It also doesn't have a cooldown outside of the normal GCD itself, at least with the enhanced Faerie Fire talent. Because this ability would incur no cooldown, it actually paved the way to create the more lunar-oriented Guardian Druid we know of today in retail. Where Moonfire is now pressed, it would originally have been Faerie Fire instead, just instead decreasing the target of the armor. Although truth be told, the ability itself wasn't actually that fun to press, and it felt more like a hassle than anything, unless in a PvP scenario against a rogue or another druid. So it's only at number 9. But it was nice to have an additional raid utility outside of Mark of the Wild for a group if a warrior happened to be absent. And at number 8, we have Wild Mushroom, specifically its Bloom and Detonate variations. Originally added in WoW during Cataclysm, the Wild Mushroom would sprout a mushroom at a chosen location, working like a shaman's totem. After about 6 seconds, the mushroom would disappear, at least visually, but it was still there technically. You could have up to 3 mushrooms planted at a time, and after they disappeared, you could then choose to either cause them to bloom or detonate. In Cataclysm, the only option was to detonate the mushroom. So what would often happen is the druid would get their 3 mushrooms out while a tank gathers an AoE pool together, and once the pack is situated, the druid would be ready. After this, they would detonate the mushrooms and cause large amounts of damage to hit all of the mobs in its 6-yard radius. What makes this button especially useful, however, is that it was able to hit everything around it unrestricted by a target cap. Many spells in WoW will actually have a hidden target cap on the tooltip which will specify such. Typically, this means you will still hit everything around you, but it will be for a reduced amount up to a certain number of mobs, usually 6 to 8. This makes Wild Mushroom one of the stronger AoE abilities in a druid's kit, because it ignores this somewhat gimmicky rule, and will just hit everything if it's within the circle and it exists. You can also get them placed as the tank gathers the packs together, giving basically no issue to potential threat being built up as they do so. There's no need to worry you'll accidentally do too much damage when the mushrooms explode, and have a pack of tank mobs running for you. At least if your tank is a halfway decent at the game. In Mists of Pandaria, the Detonate was changed to be specific to only Balance and Restoration Druids, but now when it explodes, it will create fungal growth. This growth would be an 8-yard radius circle that slows enemies by 50% when entering it. This was especially useful in PvP because you can drop the mushroom around pillars and gain more distance when needed thanks to the slow it provided. Or it would force the enemy to change their pathing in order to close the distance, potentially forcing extra cooldowns in tandem. It also lasted for 20 whole seconds, so kiting around pillars and arenas was super easy for ranged druids, and eventually was removed in World of Draenor altogether, with no balancing made to try and adjust the fairness of the ability. Although during MoP, a new version of the mushroom was added, where instead of detonating it for damage, you could cause it to bloom. This worked basically the exact same as the Detonate mushroom, but now it does a burst of AoE healing to targets in its radius, and any excess will be transferred equally to the more injured party members. It was very effective at burst healing for the Restoration Kit, as Resto Druids typically required a bit of ramp to get all their hots applied to their group. Hots are also the primary way for Druids to heal, so then giving them a burst to heal specifically counters their one weakness of spot healing. It made them exceptionally stronger. Because of this, both the Detonate and Bloom mechanics of the Wild Mushroom were removed in Worlds of Draenor, as the Detonate slow was too much for PvP and Resto Druids with spot healing was a bit too much. And at number 7, we have Hurricane. This was added to Druids at the start of Vanilla WoW and has since seen a lot of reiterations until its eventual removal. Originally, the Druid will click the button and then select a target location for their Hurricane spell. When selected, they will then begin channeling a storm of damage onto enemies that are within the location every second and debuffing the enemy's hit. The debuff causes all spells and melee attacks to take 50% longer and will last for 10 seconds. As mentioned, this spell is channeled, so any movement will cancel it entirely, and therefore the player must commit to its cast. It will also cost up to 81% of your base mana. So if you wanted to cast it to do heavy damage and debuff the group you're attacking, you really had to know that you were committing to it. It should be noted that the Omen of Clarity talent would, however, proc a chance to make Hurricane a free cost spell, making it pretty efficient for bear tanks to cast before a pack is pulled to generate aggro and then shapeshift into bear form. In Wrath of Lich King, it was changed to have no cooldown, so this is where the ability shined the most, as a tank could get a pack together, and then with just one cast of Hurricane, they could melt the pack alone. This was especially easy thanks to the Glyph of Hurricane glyph, which slowed damaged enemies by 50%, making it easier for Druids to just kite the pack a bit should they rip aggro from the tank due to their damage. Eventually, in Mists of Pandaria, the slower attack speed was removed altogether, and the ability entirely in Legion due to the shift towards Astral Power mentioned earlier. Most importantly, Hurricane was also not hit capped, meaning you could pull over 8 mobs at a time and just shred their health with this button, at least in Wrath and Kata era where it was most useful. Basically, it was just a big press this and do damage button, and who doesn't like that? You just had to be a bit more cautious than most of the other classes because of it. And at number 6, we have the Essence of Gahanir. During the Legion expansion, every single class and specialization was given a very special artifact weapon pertaining to that spec. It'd be customized around the theme of the spec and the general playstyle of it too. It even had its own lore that could date back as far as the original Warcraft games sometimes. For Resto Druids, this came in the form of Gahanir, the Mother Tree, a branch from the dominion of the demigod Aviana. Each artifact would typically give the spec a brand new button to press in accordance with rotations, often something quite powerful, and it would help excel the spec to newer heights. For Restoration, this was Essence of Gahanir. With this ability, what it did was increase the healing rate of all of your applied heal over time effects by 100% for 8 seconds. So things like Rejuvenation, Regrowth, Wild Growth, and even more hots would do double their normal healing for 8 seconds. This was super useful back in Legion because it was basically a mini Tranquility, already the most efficient healing spell in the Restless kit. Tranquility would apply a large hot effect to your whole group that healed for giant amounts when pressed, so long as the Druid was casting it for the full 8 seconds. And because this was also a hot, it could be further amplified by the Essence of Gahanir, if it was needed to layer your cooldowns, of course. Usually this wasn't the case, but regardless, it allowed for Restos to more easily heal off burst damage so long as their hots were already applied to their group. So mechanically, this button was nothing but a positive with Resto Druids, and sadly it was removed by the end of Legion to make way for the BFA systems in its place. Although that does bring us to our next entry. And at number 5, we have Ashamane's Frenzy. In a similar way to Restoration Druids, Feral Druids could obtain their own artifact in the form of the Claws of Ashmane. These were super novel for the time because they actually completely changed your Druid cat form and really gave you the class fantasy that you've been looking for. Regardless, Feral Druids at the point had been split up since Mists of Pandaria to be its own DPS spec rather than share with a Guardian Druid we understand today. As back in the day, you could play Feral as a DPS spec, but it was more typically seen as a tank before anything else because of the way the talents functioned and gear for the time. If you're unfamiliar, Feral Druid specifically deals in combo point oriented rotations and applying as many bleeds to the target as possible, dealing very high physical damage over time while also weaving in nature damage at times. When it comes to Ashenbane's Fury, you would actually attack your chosen target 15 times in succession over 3 seconds, resulting in 5 hits per second for nearly 25% of your attack power. You would also then leave a high damaging 6-second bleed to the target to then be further amplified by the many abilities in your class's spell kit. It also was a relatively short cooldown at the time and can be semi-compared to the Convoke the Spirits ability we know from Shadowlands. Although instead of Ashenbane's casting random spells from your entire class list, it now just attacks from the Feral spec instead. Comboing this artifact ability with things like Incarnation could lead you to some super high burst damage in single target fights, and could even catch people off guard in PvP. This was largely in part to the Bloodletter's Fatality and Open Wounds traits, which could be unlocked from the Feral artifact. Open Wounds would allow you to ignore 15% of your enemy's armor while Rip was applied, which was basically at all times the way Feral plays. It was also just super fun to watch your cat constantly swipe at the target in succession while still applying even more bleeds to the target. Super simple to practice, and thanks to line up with your Incarnation ability rather easily, trying to track your cooldown lineups was never a tough strategy for most players. And at number 4, we have Genesis. This was added to Mists of Pandaria and served mainly as the pseudo replacement of the wild mushrooms. What Genesis did was when it was pressed, it consumed all active rejuvenation on your allies and would change the hot to Genesis instead. Genesis essentially was just a clone of rejuvenation because its own healing was rejuvenation, but over 3 seconds instead of the regular 12. It still does the same amount of healing a rejuve would do for its full duration, but now with it being over 3 seconds, it heals a lot more and faster than a regular rejuve would. They could just tank a lot of Raid's mechanics if they timed their hot usage correctly, and it was actually a crucial play for Race the World First and Hellfire Citadel specifically, netting a Restoration Druid in the group for when Archimonde was first brought down. It's basically just a button that turns your active rejuves into a much more enhanced version of themselves, and you could watch your group's health jump up to higher numbers than before, so it was pretty awesome to witness as the healers themselves. Because Genesis provided such a similar burst of healing power for Resto Druids, the Wild Mushroom Bloom mechanic was removed entirely, as Blizzard believed giving them 2 burst healing options would make them too strong, and it surely would have, as even with just 1, they were a great spec to bring to Mythic Raids at the time of Warlords of Draenor. And at number 3, we have Displacer Beast. Added to Mists of Pandaria, Displacer Beast was a level 15 Druid talent node, sharing with Feline Swiftness and Wild Charge. Now originally, the talent used to be very different until its eventual removal. Essentially, it would teleport the Druid in a completely random direction up to 20 yards, but also purge all negative effects from them. Additionally, they will be granted stealth for 10 seconds after the teleport, and will automatically be shifted into cat form. This mostly saw play in PvP for its ability to purge negative effects from you, but it wasn't until patch 5.2 that it was reworked into a more popularly known ability. This version instead teleports you 20 yards forward instead of at random, and retains the automatic cat form. Just now, as you're entering cat form, you gain a movement speed buff for 50% for 4 seconds, allowing for quick getaways. Its cooldown was also lowered from 3 minutes to 30 seconds, which was super nice for both PvP and PvE alike. If any Druid specialization found themselves in situations they need to basically use a Mage's Blink on top of a mini version of a Rogue Sprint, this was their gambit. It remained this way for quite a long time too, just giving a Druid a whole new way to navigate troublesome mechanics and people whenever it suits them. Plus, because they're shifting to cat form as the button is pressed, they are removing any potential movement impairing effects along the way, such as a Death Knight's Chains of Ice. It wasn't until Legion that the talent was instead made to be a level 30 talent and lowered the speed increase to 2 seconds instead of 4. Regardless, the talent was still super popular, and it gave an already very mobile class even more versatile movement. Sadly, it was removed in BFA and hasn't seen a return since, likely because giving a Druid such power was too much of a bother to even attempt to balance, despite the fact it remained that way for nearly 2 expansions. Or maybe the Feral Druid that ganked you with this was just a secret mage in disguise. And at number 2, we have the Claws of Shirvallah. Following the Mop Talent Tree revamp, Warlords of Draenor opted to add an additional row to the talent trees and give all classes even more depth to their skill ceiling. They would be unlocked at level 100 at the time, and the Claws of Shirvallah would be shared with Lunar Inspiration and Blood Talents. Needless to say, Lunar Inspiration just made you weave Moonfire into your Feral rotation, and Blood Talents was super gimmicky for things like duels and battlegrounds because of the usage of Healing Touch. They were damage increases, sure, but the absolute shine were the Claws of Shirvallah. This talent would permanently change your cat form into a half-man, half-cat creature, otherwise known as a Saberon. This was the first time Blizzard introduced a new way to customize any of the Druid form appearances, and was almost immediately well loved by the community. Not only that, but the forms were just stellar, giving a very unique way to play the class when observing its animations and fast-paced movement with other talents like Displacer Beast from before. While in this cat form, you follow the same rules as the regular cat form, but are now allowed to use non-damaging spells while in the form. Normally while in cat form, attempting to cast something like Regrowth to heal yourself will instead immediately take you out of the form and return you to normal. This is important because it removes your natural buff to polymorph immunity and movement speed base increases. But thanks to this talent, you can now keep this at all times and use healing spells, roots, and other non-damaging spells on your targets without the cost of having to shift out of cat form and back into it. Plus, it just gave you a flat 5% versatility buff while in the form, giving you even more incentive to just stay in your cat form than ever as Feral. This talent was good in PvE because of the base 5% versatility you would gain, but it especially shined in PvP. Being able to root, stun, or slow your opponent without the need of shapeshifting changed the game against Druids immensely. This made them one of the strongest DPS classes in PvP for the time, and even when you finally get through all of their easily managed CC, they can heal themselves while still in the cat form. But what was to say they couldn't just shift into bear form as well to become tankier on the spot if they're doing too much damage? Feral Druids were just an absolute menace in arenas, and it was really difficult to deal with them for many players. But it must be said this talent was praised very highly for its uniqueness at the time, and made Feral players very excited to leap around constantly as their weird cat creature. Sadly, it was removed in Legion to make way for the other cat forms introduced in the expansion, mostly the ones we mentioned earlier when it came to Ashmane's Claws. Hopefully Blizzard can at least bring back this cat form as a glyph or customization of some sort for Feral players, or even all Druid specializations now thanks to the modern barbershop changes. And finally, at number 1, we have Symbiosis. When it came to the talent tree remakes of Mists of Pandaria, it was fortunate of Blizzard to not add this ability as a selection amongst others, as the other two surely would have been abandoned for this button. Instead, it was learned by all Druid specializations at level 87. Upon pressing Symbiosis, it would create a link with your target, specifically a friendly player that you chose. Depending on the class you chose, the Druid would then be gifted an ability from the class you selected based around your specialization. An example of this is if you were a balanced Druid and cast Symbiosis on a Paladin, you'd be given Hammer of Justice. It worked exactly the same as a regular Hammer of Justice would, stunning the target and then incurring a cooldown. It did work a bit differently sometimes, as the cooldown would often be increased from its original value, but this was just the most common occurrence for certain abilities. Though this didn't steal the Paladin's Hammer of Justice, it simply duplicated it and gave it to you also, now netting you both the exact same stun. In exchange though, the Druid themselves would then grant the target, in this case the Paladin, a new ability of their own from the Druid spellbook based around their specialization. So if the Paladin was Retribution for example, they would gain Wrath, which was actually pretty solid at the time as it gave Paladins some range damage during short downtimes outside of their regular Judgment casts. Now basically apply this rule to every single class and specialization and you have Symbiosis. This was an absolute balancing nightmare, as trying to grapple between nerfing the original class that is given the Druid's ability or the Druid themselves was insanely hard. It's been a big lesson on Blizzard's part to never give a class an ability from another, as it complicates the understood balance of the game far too much. Regardless, this was one of the coolest buttons Blizzard has ever introduced to the game also. See, Symbiosis would last an hour upon application, persisting through death, and only canceled if the Druid's target was too far away from them. You could probably imagine the headache this caused some players in arenas, as when a Druid gave it to a priest, they'd be rewarded with Cyclone if Discipline or Holy. A good Cyclone cast is already one of the strongest CCC abilities in arenas, and given an entirely different class's ability on a separate cooldown from the Druid's own, was very difficult to combat against. More importantly, the Druids themselves now also have Dispersion, allowing for even more damage reduction should danger come their way. The cast was only around 2 seconds as well, so a quick Druid could swap the Symbiosis target with their raid or party members and give themselves and their friends something to defend themselves with on the spot. It created a world where the Druid had to memorize a lot of spells from different classes so they could maximize the benefits from each specialization. But also, now the receiving target of the Symbiosis cast has a new button to play with, sometimes in the form of a brand new ability like Wild Mushroom Plague for DPS DKs, allowing for a much easier spread of their diseases when they placed a mushroom, like the ones mentioned previously on this list. Though of course the ability was eventually removed, only lasting the single expansion it was introduced in, and it's easy to understand why. Players, and even Blizzard themselves, could never make this ability work in a world where everyone has fun, including the receiving end, and it complicated defensive lineups for certain higher end raid encounters. But it's very likely Mista Pandaria Classic could be a thing in the future, meaning this ability could make an eventual comeback in all of its unbalanced glory for players to re-experience. Alright, and this completes our list. Are there any other Druid abilities that have been removed that you wish made this list in place of another? Or maybe you disagree with the list and want to get your thoughts out? Be sure to leave those thoughts down below, and any potential ideas for future videos if there's a certain type you want to see.